There is a specific kind of discomfort that comes from watching someone try to win over a person who is clearly looking past them. Not at someone else in the abstract, but at someone specific. Someone standing right in the same room. That is the feeling I keep coming back to when I think about Darcey Silva and Georgi Rusev. And I want to be honest about something before we even get into it. A lot of what I am going to say today is my read on what was actually shown. I will tell you when I am speculating and when I am working from documented, aired footage. This is not a hit piece, and it is not a gossip dump. What it is an attempt to seriously analyze one of the most psychologically interesting and genuinely sad dynamics the 90-Day franchise has ever produced. The thesis, stated plainly, Georgi Rusev treated Darcey Silva with a level of visible indifference that, when you put it next to how he talked about Stacey and Florian's relationship, starts to form a pattern. Whether that pattern means what some fans have been saying it means, I honestly do not know. But the pattern is there. It was caught on camera, and I think it deserves more than a meme. What I want to work through today is not just Georgi's behavior. It is also Darcey's response to it, because that is where things get genuinely complex. Darcey is not a passive victim in this story, and treating her like one does her a disservice. She made choices, many of them visibly driven by her relationship with her twin, and those choices shaped everything that followed. The twin dynamic in this family is not background noise. For Darcey, I think it was the entire stage on which she tried to build her marriage, and that is a real problem. So let's actually get into it. Darcey and Stacey Silva grew up together, obviously, and if you have watched even an hour of their combined television output, you already know that their relationship is one of the most codependent sibling bonds reality TV has ever put on screen. They finish each other's sentences. They dress alike. They have gone to Turkey together for extensive cosmetic surgery not once, but multiple times, and they genuinely seem to experience each other's emotional states almost as their own. That level of closeness is real, and it is touching, but it also means that for Darcey, the question of how am I doing has always been answered partly in relation to how Stacey is doing. This matters because when Darcey entered her relationship with Georgi, she did not bring just herself. She brought the twin. The four of them, Darcey, Georgi, Stacey, and Florian, operated almost as a unit, and a huge portion of the early Darcey and Stacey seasons was built around group dynamics, joint vacations, shared meals, and scenes where both couples were evaluated against each other whether the show acknowledged it or not. And here is where I want to be specific about what was actually on camera. Georgi was visibly less warm toward Darcey in group settings than Florian was toward Stacey. That is not a fabrication or a fan theory. It was something a lot of viewers noticed watching the same aired footage. Florian, whatever his own story is, performed affection towards Stacey in a way that read as present and engaged. Georgi, in comparable settings, often came across as distracted or mildly tolerant. Now, television editing is real. Context gets cut, and I am not going to claim I know what happened off camera. But we can only work with what was shown, and what was shown was a consistent contrast. There were also specific moments, documented in aired episodes, where Georgi talked about Stacey and Florian's marriage in ways that did not sit right. He has referenced their relationship as a kind of example or benchmark in conversations with Darcey, and the implication, whether he intended it or not, was that their relationship compared unfavorably. When you tell someone who already feels like she is running a race against her twin that the other couple is doing it better, you are not giving constructive feedback. You are handing someone a comparison she cannot win on your terms. I want to stop here and be clear. I am not attributing specific quotes to Georgi that I am not certain of. He has made comments on camera that read as comparative, and viewers and recappers documented those reactions as they aired. What was in his head, what his actual feelings about Stacey were, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is what was captured and what the effect appeared to be. The effect on Darcey was, from what was visible, not anger at Georgi. It was internalization. She turned the comparison inward. And I think this is the most genuinely painful part of this whole story. When Darcey and Stacey flew to Turkey for surgery, they did it together, as they have done before. That in itself is not unusual for them. But watching the footage and hearing how Darcey talked about it, specifically how she talked about wanting to feel the best version of herself, there is a reading of those scenes where she is not just doing this for herself, she is doing it to close a gap she believes exists. Whether that gap is real or something she constructed, partly from Georgi's comments and partly from years of measuring herself against her twin, is genuinely hard to say. My read is that it was both, and that neither source alone fully explains the degree of effort she was putting in. This is not me saying plastic surgery is pathological, or that wanting to look a certain way is evidence of emotional crisis. People make those choices for all kinds of reasons. What I am saying is that the specific timing and framing of how Darcey discussed her appearance during this period, combined with what was documented about the relationship dynamics at the time, points towards someone who believed she needed to physically transform to earn something that should not require transformation to earn in the first place. And Georgi, to the extent we saw his reactions, did not register this with any visible warmth or appreciation. That is what kept snagging for me while rewatching some of this. She was working so hard, visibly and literally, to be something, and the person she was working to impress was not exactly throwing himself into meeting her halfway. Now I want to talk about Stacey's role in this, because she is not a passive background character. Stacey loves her sister. That seems genuinely true based on everything aired. But she also exists in a family system where the twin dynamic is competitive in ways that are not always spoken out loud. There were moments where Stacey seemed to enjoy being the stable one, the one in the functional marriage, the one whose husband was not a source of constant crisis. That is a very human response. If your sibling has been struggling and your life looks comparatively settled, it can feel validating in ways you might not fully admit to yourself. I am not accusing Stacey of malice. What I think happened is more subtle, which is that the competition between them was so baked into their dynamic that even Stacey was not immune to it, even if she was on the favorable end. When Georgi praised elements of how Stacey operated, those compliments landed inside a system where Stacey and Darcey were already measuring themselves against each other. So even if Georgi was just making a neutral observation, the context turned it into ammunition. Darcey heard it as failure. And Stacey, even if she did not weaponize it intentionally, benefited from it. Here is the part that I think gets overlooked in most fan discussions about this. Darcey knew all of this. She is not naive. She has talked openly in various interviews about how much the twin dynamic affects her and about the ways she has struggled with self-worth over the years. She was not walking into these dynamics blind. She chose to stay in the marriage anyway, to keep building her life alongside this man, and I think the question of why she stayed is a lot more interesting than the question of whether Georgi was terrible. My honest opinion, and I want to be clear this is just my reading, is that Darcey was not trying to beat Stacey. She was trying to prove to herself that she was capable of having what Stacey had. The marriage to Georgi was not just a relationship. It became a demonstration. If she could make it work, if she could hold on to a man who seemed difficult and indifferent, it would mean something about her. Not about Stacey, specifically, but about herself relative to Stacey, which in this family system is basically the same thing. That is an exhausting way to be in a relationship. It is also not Georgi's fault entirely, though he was not helping. When someone turns you into a symbolic object, a trophy in a private competition you may not even know you are part of, things deteriorate fast. And deteriorate they did. The financial dimension of this relationship has been discussed a lot, and I want to address it carefully because there are things that were documented and things that were speculated. What was shown on camera was real financial tension. Darcey spent significantly on their life together, on travel, on maintaining a certain lifestyle, and the balance of that investment was not evenly distributed. What that means legally or morally, I am not going to claim to know. But what it meant emotionally, in the context of everything else we have talked about, is that she was paying to maintain something she was not fully receiving. That specific combination, the financial output and the emotional emptiness coming back in, is the part of this story I find genuinely sad. Because money, in this context, was standing in for something. When someone you love makes you feel like you are always one step short of deserving them, one surgery short, one outfit short, one version of yourself short, you keep trying to fill the gap with resources, with effort, with change. Darcey had the means to keep trying, and she did, and Georgi let her. Now I want to steelman the other side of this, because fairness requires it. There is a real argument that we are projecting onto Georgi a narrative he may not fit. Reality television specifically selects for conflict. If Georgi had 10 warm, easy conversations with Darcey off camera, we would not see them. We would see the argument over money, the tense dinner, the moment he said something that landed wrong. The edit is not neutral, and I am aware of that. There is also the argument that Darcey, by her own admission, was not always easy to be in a relationship with. She has a history of intense emotional reactions, high expectations for romantic gestures and declarations, and a tendency to spiral when she feels insecure. None of that is a character flaw in isolation. All of it becomes complicated when you are partnered with someone who does not have a high tolerance for emotional expression. A mismatch like that does not require a villain. It just requires incompatibility, and incompatibility is boring television, so the show frames it as betrayal and manipulation. Georgi also deserves some consideration as a person whose full context we do not have. He is from Bulgaria. He came into a family system, the Silva twins, with its own rules and dynamics and history that he did not grow up in. Being constantly evaluated against Florian, being brought into twin trips and twin comparisons and twin timelines, that is not a simple environment to navigate even with the best intentions. I am not excusing how he treated Darcey. I am noting that bad partner and secretly obsessed with his sister-in-law are two very different claims, and the evidence for the second one is thinner than some fan accounts make it sound. What I think is probably true is somewhere quieter and less cinematic than the conspiracy theory. I think Georgi saw in Stacey and Florian's relationship a version of domestic peace that his relationship with Darcey was not providing, and instead of working toward that peace with Darcey, he pointed at it like a critique. Whether that was intentional manipulation or just thoughtless communication, I cannot say. What it produced was damage, and damage does not require intent. The fan theory that Georgi wanted Stacey is compelling because it explains everything neatly. It gives Darcey a sympathetic frame. It gives Georgi a motive. It gives Stacey a secret role. It's a satisfying story, but I am genuinely skeptical of it. Not because I think Georgi was a good partner, but because he preferred the other twin is a very specific claim, and the actual evidence on camera is a man who seemed consistently checked out, not specifically drawn toward anyone in particular. Checking out is its own problem. It does not need to be a romantic rivalry to be damaging. What I keep coming back to is this. The most painful thing about watching Darcey during this period was not that she might have been competing with her sister. It was that she was competing at all. She was in a marriage, and she was performing for it instead of living in it. She was making herself smaller and also bigger and also different, cycling through versions of herself, trying to find the one that would finally make Georgi look at her the way she wanted to be looked at. And from everything visible on camera, that version never arrived. That is not a love story with a villain. It is something slower and sadder than that. I think Darcey is one of the more genuinely compelling people the 90-Day franchise has produced, not because her choices were always good, they were not, but because the things driving her choices are recognizable. I want to be chosen, wanting to be the one who is enough, wanting to stop losing a race that should not have started. Most people who have ever compared themselves to a sibling, a friend, a coworker, know some version of that feeling, even if the scale of Darcey's life amplifies it into something almost operatic. Stacey, for her part, has built something that looks stable from the outside. Whether Florian and Stacey's marriage is genuinely what it appears to be, I do not know enough to say. What I do know is that Darcey spent a significant chunk of her post-40 years trying to build something that looked like what Stacey had, with a man who did not particularly seem to want to help her build it. And Georgi walked away from the marriage with a different immigration status than he arrived with, and Darcey walked away with the bill. I will say this plainly, as my actual opinion. I do not think Georgi was secretly in love with Stacey. I think he was a man who found a situation that worked for him longer than it should have, who compared his girlfriend unfavorably to her sister in ways that were cruel, even if not calculated, and who contributed significantly to the erosion of someone who was already fighting her own self-doubt. That is plenty. It does not need the romantic conspiracy layer to be a damaging story. What it needs, honestly, is for us to look at it clearly instead of through the lens of the next plot twist. Darcey Silva is a real person. She has children and a business and a public life that she has built under conditions most people would find exhausting. She has also made genuinely difficult choices, stayed in things too long, chased the wrong approval from the wrong people. So have most of us, just without cameras. The uncomfortable thing about this story is not the conspiracy theory. The uncomfortable thing is how familiar the core dynamic is. Someone who loves too hard in the wrong direction, someone who lets them, and a comparison that was never actually the point, but became everything anyway. That is what happened here, as far as I can tell. And that is more than enough to think about.